Well, this might be a little known fact to you, but in 2020, 182 Australian workers were killed at work. And this year alone in Victoria, 19 workers have died. That's so many families who have lost a husband, a mother, a daughter, someone who has lost their parent or their son. It's so devastating, and there are so many people losing very dear people to them. At Broad Radio, we tell the stories of women, and because over 90% of the people who are killed at work are men, today we're acknowledging the partners who are left behind. And we are going to meet an extraordinary woman whose husband was killed at work and the lawyer who has worked very closely with her for justice. So we're very pleased to welcome from Maurice Blackburn Lawyers, Azmeena Hussain, Principal Lawyer, Work Injuries. Azmeena, it's lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you too, Jo. Thank you for having me.
And Dr. Lana Cormie, veterinary doctor and mother of 2 young children, Sophie and George, and wife of Charlie Howkins. Lana, it is great to have you on Broad Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Azmeena and Lana, there are so many layers to your story, but I want to acknowledge that, Lana, in everything that I've read about your experience, you've said that you really felt like you didn't have a voice. And so I want to start with your story and with your element to this whole conversation. Can you tell us what you can about the circumstances around Charlie's death?
Yeah, so Charlie was 34 years old when he was killed at work 3 years ago. He was working on some sewer trenching in Ballarat with his workmate Jack Brownlee, who was also killed that day on the 21st of March 2018. We don't have a lot of information about what actually happened that day, and the case is still before the courts. But what I can say is that, you know, life's been very tough ever since, and Charlie and my children, Sophie and George, and myself have, I guess, have the rug pulled from under us. It's been very challenging.
I can imagine that it is an extremely difficult thing to pull your life together after such an extreme loss. But you chose, in the aftermath of this, to work tirelessly for workplace change. Why is that?
Yeah, look, I guess early on I had a moment where I sort of looked to the heavens and thought, no, that's it. I refuse to become a victim in this, and let my children become a victim. Of course, we had many challenges, but I suppose in many ways it was the timing of the incident where Charlie and Jack were killed. It came after many, many years of campaigning by other families and the union movement and many others to try and get some change in the legislation around workplace safety. And because our incident occurred in the lead up to an election, it provided an opportunity for us to kind of join that voice and to speak up and try and help to make change.
And what sorts of change specifically were you fighting for?
So at that time, the campaign was primarily for workplace manslaughter legislation in Victoria. We have, I guess, been also working for other changes, but that's been the primary big one that we were working towards, and that came into action on July 1st last year.
Azmeena, what is so important about that particular legislation, the workplace manslaughter legislation?
Yeah, it's essentially it's almost life-changing law. As Lana mentioned, the laws came into effect in July of last year, and essentially what it's done is it now means that industrial workplace manslaughter, so workplace manslaughter, is now a criminal offence. So employers can now face fines of up to $16.5 million for companies, but most importantly, individuals can now face jail time of up to 25 years for individuals. And I mean, that's quite significant change, because for years, as a workplace injury lawyer, we've been advocating for families to seek justice and to obtain justice. But essentially those actions that we've brought have been against what I'd consider as a faceless employer. employers who have just walked away with maybe a fine against their company entity or a fine against an ABN and not even a slap on the wrist. But now these laws mean that individuals will be held to account, and no longer can they just walk away with just a fine, and families can get some element of justice from that process.
And Lana, this was particularly important to you because I know the difference between this law and what was previously the case, it really puts the person who has lost their life at the centre of it as well.
Yeah, so the way that the OHS laws are designed is that they are designed to prosecute on a failure to mitigate a risk in a workplace. The reason for that is because the aim is that we don't get to the point where we're losing lives or having serious injuries. Unfortunately, most often we don't see the law used in that way. But now we do actually have the one part of that legislation which actually acknowledges the outcome of those risks. And to me, that's really important because these are real people being killed, real families being affected. And to me, it was the ultimate insult for our laws not to even acknowledge that those people existed, that these cases are purely about a failure to mitigate risk and not about a real person or people who have been killed. So that has now changed.
It feels as though just an extraordinary thing that you were able to do in the years after losing your beautiful husband and to be picking up the pieces for your two children, to be going into battle for this massive change of legislation. How did you manage that?
Well, I guess in situations where people are experiencing grief and in shock, we all respond really differently, and it's a very individual process. But for me, it was my way of dealing with the trauma of Charlie's senseless death and the anger around that, that we've been failed by a system. And I suppose when prior to Charlie's death, I had been blissfully ignorant to the fact that our processes and systems were broken, and indeed our laws were insufficient. So once I discovered that that was the case, I guess I really felt that I had an obligation both to Charlie, both to society more generally, to myself, and even more so to my children and the next generation to at least try to do something. I just felt that, one day my children will be at work. One day everyone's children will be at work, and they deserve better than this, as we all do. And also they need to have the right to be able to speak up for what is right in this world. And in this case, I discovered something that was really wrong. And so to sit back and do nothing, I just felt I couldn't do that.
Azmeena, how important to the change of this legislation has Lana's work been?
Oh, it's been incredible. I mean, even just hearing what she's just said then, the work that Lana's doing now has a significant impact on everyone. I mean, on our own families. Lana's been a tireless advocate for workplace safety, and I don't often speak about my clients in front of them, so this is a bit different. But there's no denying that. I mean, Lana's been a tireless advocate for the development and implementation of these important laws that have tightened the way in which workplace safety is considered, both from an employer and from a worker perspective. Lana single-handedly really has lobbied government and has created this change. And I remember when I first met Lana, the resilience that she showed and essentially the leadership since then has been incredible. I mean, she's taken this enormous personal tragedy and used her own injustice to do so much good, to redefine the narrative for families and workers for years to come. So Lana is doing some great work now, which I'll let her speak to, but most certainly me and as a firm at Maurice Blackburn want to continue to support that great work, to continue to lobby for change, to do our part in creating that cultural change, because she has done such incredible work in such a short period of time, and it's to be commended.
And Lana, we will hear in just a moment exactly what more work you are doing and what more change has has happened and what still needs to be done. But I do want to ask, how critical was it to you to find the right lawyer to represent you and lead you through this process?
Yeah, look, I think it's incredibly important to find the right firm and the right person. First of all, I guess a piece of advice for anyone who unfortunately might find themselves in my situation, I would suggest to speak to a few firms and just see who you feel comfortable with and who you trust and feel you can connect with, because you're going to walk a bit of a journey with them and you want to feel supported and know that they are the experts in their field. And also I would suggest that looking to expert firms who do this as their bread and butter, who are experts in work cover claims and specifically deal with that day in and day out, I would strongly suggest that, because if you find the right firm and the right person to deal with that for you, it takes a really big weight off your mind, and you've got so much going on that the last thing you need to do is be concerned about, your legal process.
So, Azmeena, thinking about people who may have experienced their own situations of workplace injury, there are many different kinds of workplace injuries, aren't there? Can you just outline what that looks like for us?
Yeah, absolutely. The definition of injury is quite broad. So, of course, it includes things such as a physical injury, as you'd know it, but as well as that, it includes things such as diseases, silicosis, exposure to asbestosis, and of course the increasing claims around mental health. So whether it's workplace harassment, bullying, being overworked, and of course deaths in the workplace that include things such as suicide or other fatalities. So it is quite broad ranging, and we run a busy practice, that's for sure.
And would you say that there are people who are tolerating situations now in which perhaps they have been injured or they are experiencing mental health injuries that you speak of there, and they aren't speaking up? They feel like they're fearful to actually pursue their rights.
Absolutely. I mean, workers are afraid to speak up and exercise the workplace right, which fundamentally is a human right. And I mean, there's already a significant power imbalance between employers and workers. And now in a post-COVID era, there's even this greater sense that workers feel that power imbalance and that sense that they can't speak up because of fear of losing their job, and are afraid to raise issues in the workplace, or their sense of feeling uncomfortable to comply with shortcuts that employers are directing them to do. But what workers should know and understand is that there are laws to protect workers, both within the workplace injury legislation and within industrial laws as well. And most of all, I can't really stress the importance of collective action and the role that unions can play in really rebalancing that power and standing up for workers. Here at Maurice Blackburn, we work very closely with all our unions in that fight for fair and in that fight for readjusting that power imbalance that employers think they have. And it's so important that workers understand that they have a voice and that they have a platform to be heard, and that they should ensure that they utilise that.
So if someone is feeling at the moment that they are, struggling with an injury or that they would like some advice, what's their best course of action?
Yeah, absolutely. Workers most certainly should seek that advice and should not be afraid that they will be reprimanded by their employer, because there are laws to protect them. A good starting point is to join a union. If you are a member of a union, to speak with your union, and most certainly otherwise there are firms such as Maurice Blackburn that can assist, even just in providing that advice to know where you stand. Knowledge is power, and it's a good starting point. So certainly go out and get that information, knowing that there is no consequences for exercising what is basically a fundamental human right, your right to feel safe and protected in your place of employment.
So Lana, tell us more about what your work is at the moment. What are you working towards?
So we have seen some positive change since we started this process and since workplace manslaughter laws were brought in. And one of those changes has been the introduction of a workplace incidents consultative committee, which is basically providing a legislative committee as a direct voice to the minister, which will allow us to hopefully continue, and other families to continue to bring about positive change, and to, I guess, also keep WorkSafe and the government accountable in terms of how that should look, and make sure that's going in the right direction. So that committee has just up and running now, and I'm a part of that along with 14 other members. The other big piece of work that I'm doing at the moment is I've started working in a role as part of Be Safe Victoria, and our new organisation is basically put in place to train, support and promote safety in regional Victoria. So we provide training to workers so that they understand their rights and know how to speak up, know what their legislative rights are, and as Azmeena mentioned, knowledge is power, and I think that's really important to empower our workers in that way.
And is there anything that still needs to be done on work sites, in workplaces, that is not being done to keep people safe?
Well, we could talk about that all day. Until there's no one dying at work, there'll always be more to do. And certainly workplace manslaughter laws are not a panacea, they are but the tip of the iceberg. There has been much work done historically, and I guess I also want to acknowledge the work of other affected families and the unions and firms like Maurice Blackburn and others who have contributed towards so much change already. But there is a lot more to do. And part of that includes reform within the regulator, so WorkSafe. We have already had an increase in the number of inspectors and investigators in WorkSafe, but we're still yet to see the impact of that change and their increase in training and how that will play out in real terms on the ground. We do need to see better quality investigations. We need to see the amount of evidence being put together towards appropriate prosecutions. We need to see basically a workplace fatality being treated equally to what we would expect of a road fatality. That workplace be treated as a real crime scene, that appropriate evidence be collected, that investigations be really broad and deep, and then that can lead on to what needs to be really meaningful prosecutions. Because without a meaningful prosecution, workplace manslaughter or any of the OH&S Act will never represent a real and true deterrent in real terms. So we need real accountability for breaching the Act, and that includes whether a death or injury has occurred. And we have to remember that the OH&S Act is a risk-based law. It is designed to prevent injury and death, and we need to start seeing that used to bring prosecutions for people who have not yet killed or injured someone but have a risk that they have not mitigated. So that's really important to prevent fatalities and injuries. But of course, when one does occur, we need to see the full force of the law brought in those cases when appropriate. But certainly education is really important. We need to work from the bottom and the top to empower the workers so that they understand what's right and what's wrong, that they know their rights, that they can stand up and speak up, and that they don't have to work under unsafe conditions, and that they shouldn't work under unsafe conditions, that they have that right and that the legislation supports them. And then we need to also see from the top that the employers are really taking that seriously. And that's an important role for the new workplace manslaughter legislation, is to hopefully bring front of mind to the employers and the board members and those in positions of authority that not only have they always had a really important role in legislation to keep their workers safe, now they can be held personally accountable. So we're hoping to see that translate into a much greater focus on the importance of safety in their workplaces.
Lana, just finally, you mentioned affected families there, and you've been such a loud voice representing them. Have you received, any kind of feedback from those families? Have you had thanks? Is there a community around affected families that you're a part of?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a community, and both within Victoria and nationally. There's a very active group of families, state and federally, who continue to lobby and work to positive change. We've had a Senate inquiry into industrial death, which brought together 17 families from across the country. And those families still continue to work together and to support one another. Now we also see a committee come together in Victoria, which is bringing families together again, and those that are in the place or that it is their journey to be involved in that change. It's really fantastic to have that forum to work together. But certainly, even outside of those two things, families in general, I find, are just so supportive to one another. And when you can reach out and find someone else who knows how it feels, it gives you an incredible sense of not being so alone.
Well, I think that the whole of Australia is indebted to you, Lana, for the work that you've done to hopefully keep workers much safer when we go to work. So thank you so much for your time today, Lana, and thank you also, Azmeena, for your time.
Thanks.